And now we're going to take a look at using color functions to change the bottom of those flames to blue. And I'm using the scene we had before we had any of the changes made to our color. So just the base fire that we'd created before. And I just want to make some modifications. I'm going to delete our cylinder. I'm also going to take our meta blob that we currently have made from a cone and a sphere, and I'm going to bake this to polygons. And that way we're working just with one object, and since we're not going to be changing the actual shape, it'll be a lot easier to use just a regular object instead of a meta blob. So I'm going to select right mouse click, go to bake to polygons. Now we want to make sure we have enough polygons to really make that total shape. So I'm going to do about 32,000. And you can see that has also altered the shape of our fire just slightly. But overall, we're going to end up with a much better looking flame because of that. Because metablobs can sometimes cause some artifacts here and there, depending on how many objects we're using to create it. Since we were only using 2 before, we probably wouldn't have noticed too many artifacts, but once we bake this to polygons, it'll definitely remove any problems that we could see having. So I'm going to open up our properties now, and I want to remove our current animation for our material where we have turbulence and rotation set. And I'm just going to select that keyframe and hit delete. So now we're working with an object that is only animated by our velocity of material origin. So as we scrub through the animation, we can still see our flames going upward, but it's no longer controlled by the rotation function or the turbulence function. And it does look a little bit different than our render, but overall, it still basically looks the same. So we're going to open up the material editor now, making sure we're at frame 0. And we want to right mouse click on our color production and go to edit function. And now we can see our current function. And now typically when you look at an effect like this, you would want to use something like our altitude input node. And that way our flames and the color is based on that altitude. The only problem with that is once we animate, we're going to have some overall changes, and really our material is going to move upward. And one of the best things we can actually use for this is actually slope. The only thing we need to make sure we do is just have the bottom of our fire object a little bit larger than the top. And that's actually pretty easy. And we'll take a look at applying this to other objects. But first, let's go ahead and just set up this color variation. So I'm going to zoom in. And I also want to note that I have changed our links, so they're no longer straight lines. And I just turn that off in our options, where we have show links as straight lines. And that way we can have some nice curves. And since we're working with a very complex function and lots of different nodes, it's really going to be easier to display everything. So we're going to start out just by selecting our current color map. And that way, when we create our next color map, View will remember the last option that we had selected. So now we'll add a new color map, and it's automatically the last one we had selected. Now currently this is not connected to any functions, so we don't have any overall distribution of our material. So we're just going to connect this to the same filter and the same set of functions as we have for our yellow flame. And there are 2 ways we can change the color. We can either go in here and edit the actual color map and just change it to something more blue, or we can just use one of the nodes and just change the overall existing map, which is usually a little bit easier. And also gives us some more options when it comes to luminosity and saturation. So I'm going to click in our blank area and add a new color node. And we're going to change this to color correction HLS shift. And now you can see we have a hue shift, a luminosity shift, and a saturation shift. And this is going to be very helpful when we're blending, being able to use these different values. So instead of changing our overall map and adjusting our colors one by one to get it to match up, we can just use some of these settings and these 3 settings to really get it to match up. So we'll connect our HLS shift to our color map. And now we want to change our hue shift. And we can just bring that a little bit over to the right. And now you can see we're starting to get into the blue range. So we just want to get this to a nice blue color. And currently we're not going to see this set up because it's not connected to our color. But we're going to just make some changes first and then we can connect them. So I'm going to decrease our luminosity and increase our saturation. And that way we'll have a much more blue looking flame. And now if you want to see just what this blue flame is going to look like, you can just select your connection between your color map, your original color map, and the color output, delete it, and then connect that color to the HLS shift. And now we can see that blue flame. I'm going to bring down our luminosity a little bit more and decrease our saturation. But it's also not going to look this bright once we start blending because of the settings we're going to be using. So I'm going to delete our link. We're going to relink this to our existing color output of our first map, select our link, and add a combiner node, which is currently set to blender, which is what we want to leave it on because we have a ratio option. And this ratio we'll be able to control and vary our flame much better with. So now we can connect our blender to our other color, and currently it's just blending the two together. I'm going to change our combination mode to add, which is going to look a little bit better. But keep in mind, if we take a look at our luminosity now, it's extremely bright. So we are going to need to bring down our overall luminous value on our material. So I'm going to click OK, and we're just going to do that right now. Go to our Lighting and Effects tab, and change our luminous setting to about 150. And take a look. And that might be a little too low, so we can bring that up to 175. And now it's just a little bit brighter. But keep in mind the overall brightness is still going to be changed because we don't have that overall variation between the two colors yet. So now we want to go back into our function. And we can also see that it has added another color node on the bottom and an output node. And we're just going to ignore that right now because it's really not going to affect anything. But that can sometimes happen when making drastic changes to a surface that you've already pretty much finished. You can just see we just have these two output nodes, but that's really not going to affect anything. So if we go back to our blender, we have our ratio. And now we want this ratio to be entirely controlled by our slope. Like I was saying before, you can use altitude as well, but because of the way we're animating the surface, slope is really going to work the best. And that basically just limits us from using completely straight objects like a box or a cylinder that's completely up and down. But when we convert to metablobs and round off towards the top, then it's going to work very well. So I'm just going to zoom out, and I'm going to connect our blender directly to our slope. And now we can take a look, and we can already see the blue showing up on the bottom with our yellow flames on top. Now we are going to have to add some filters and a couple other options in order to make it look a little bit better and a little more realistic. Let's just click OK right now and take a look at the existing setting. We can see our blue showing up just a little bit on the bottom, but it's not really climbing very high into the flames, and the overall variation is still pretty much the same. It kind of cuts off at the same point. So what we want is the flames to travel upward into our orange, so we need to be able to adjust these values in the overall gradient of our slope. So we're going to go back into the function editor, and you can see now we have all of those extra color output nodes, but we're going to ignore those because they're really not affecting anything, just kind of our overall layout of our function. And now we need to make a few adjustments to our slope, and we can see a nice gradient reflecting exactly how our slope is reacting to our material. And we just want to adjust that gradient using a couple of different filters. We're going to start out just by making sure that link is selected, and we're going to add our first filter, and we want to change this to a brightness and contrast. This will allow us to adjust how high our flames will travel up into our other color and just blend the two together a lot easier. And we could lower our brightness, and we can see the effects that that takes, and lower our contrast as well, which will adjust the overall blending. Click OK, and we can take a look at that. We can see the blue flames are traveling up a little bit higher now. And we have a nice blend, but still, there's that cutoff for how high our blue flames are reaching. So let's go back into our function. And we're just going to ignore that little bug, because it's really not affecting our overall surface. And we're going to keep these settings the same for our brightness and contrast, and we're going to add another filter. And we want to change this from the brightness and contrast like we had last time to a partial filter. And this will allow us to use a standard filter based on a visual representation along with a filter ratio that we can connect to one of our fractals. So we could either connect this directly to this fractal or separate it. I prefer just to separate it because that way we can control the wavelength and make it a little bit different. Also change its origin so it doesn't match up perfectly, because we want a little bit of variation in those blue flames. So we'll select our simple fractal, and that way View remembers what our new fractal will need to be. Add our new fractal. You can see that's exactly the same option. And now we can adjust our ratio and connect it directly to that fractal. And if we also take a look, we can see that our opposite is currently on for this fractal. So we're going to want to add that node once again. So we'll select that opposite so it remembers what kind of filter we want to create. Select our link, click to add a filter, and now we can see that opposite function. It's been automatically added. And now we just have a little more variation in our actual function. We can click OK and take a look. And overall, the line is still about the same, but we can definitely see more variation in our overall blend between our two colors. But we also want to just increase that blue and make it climb up a little bit higher. And we're going to use our brightness and contrast filter for that. So I'll go back to edit our function. And we just want to frame this, and we can take a look. We can also see all of those other color nodes that it's kind of adding that we really don't need. This is just kind of a bug currently right now that we're just going to ignore. And we'll just move over until we can find our function. Just drag that over on the end, pull that up, and now we can see everything we're working on. So we'll let that refresh. Take a look at our brightness and contrast filter. And I'm just going to bring down our contrast a little. And we're using very small changes because they really will affect quite a large area. And then we can also decrease our brightness and take a look at the update. And if we need to, we can always increase our brightness and take a look at that overall effect. And you can see as we increase the brightness, our flames start to travel higher, and they climb up higher, because we're adjusting our overall slope. So we can click OK, and take a look at our current flames. And we can see the blue part is now much higher, but we also have an overall luminosity change because we're using the add mode. So if we need to, we can bring down our luminous setting to 150 and start to see more of our color again. And we can see that overall that hasn't changed too much, so we could either bring that value down a little bit more, or we could edit the actual color node in our HLS shift and bring down the luminosity, and that will also balance everything out. So you can see it's actually fairly easy to make our overall color change, and it looks pretty good. And then we can just scrub through our animation and take a look at the overall progress of the flames throughout the animation. And we can see those showing up. And then you can create a preview if you want, so you can really take a look at the overall effect. But I'm going to load in another scene that I was working on earlier, using pretty much the exact same parameters, except we don't have that color bug showing up where all the different output nodes were added. So I'm just going to load that in now, and you can also find that in the content folder. And now that scene is loaded in, we can see we have basically the same effect. And if we take a look at the bottom, we can also see a nice preview rendered out of the current effect. I also have a couple of other changes. And let's just take a look at that surface right now. Just double click to open it up. Go to our volumetric color. And actually, if we take a look at the luminous, you can see it's at 150. I'm going to right mouse click, go to edit our function. And you can see that bug is currently not in there where we have multiple output nodes of our color. We just have the one. But we can see one very large change. And what I've actually done, you just zoom in and take a look, is instead of using the exact same set of these functions for our blue flame, I've copied all of these over and just pretty much made the exact same setup as we had, except I've changed our origin for all of our different functions. And I've changed our origin to 10, 7, and 14 for our x, y, and z. And I've done that for both the fractal and the noise and our ratio node. Our filters are all still exactly the same, but this gives us a little more variation to our flames. And if we take a look at the preview, we can see that a little better. So instead of our flames changing from the color blue to orange, there's a nice separation, and they sort of mix in between each other. Because typically, before that blue changes to the orange in a typical flame, we have a lot of transparency where the flame almost becomes invisible. And this is a good way to reflect that. So all I really did was just copy each of these nodes over, reformed that tree, and then connected the blue color directly to it. I also have a filter that I've added underneath our partial filter, where I'm just creating a tiny curve, and that'll just change our color a little bit. We can also use other different types of filters to achieve entirely different types of effects. So it really depends on how you'd like to blend these together. And currently this material is not animated. We do have our turbulence and rotation options on, but if we go to the end of our frame, our last frame, and the end of the animation, there are no changes. So if we wanted to set that up for material animation, we could add a little bit of rotation and turbulence like we did before. Let's just take a look now at using this material that we have on other objects. And the first thing I want to show you is just what happens when we put this directly on an object without any overall slope. So we can just move our camera off to the side, and I'm going to load in a cylinder and put that off to the right. And now we can see bits of the blue throughout the entire material, just because the slope is exactly the same. Also, if you take a look at the bottom, you can see it's only blue directly on the bottom polygon. If we start to look at this from different angles, you start to see the blue more. But we also see that very sharp line just because of our change in slope. And that's the only drawback to using the slope method for controlling our blue flames. But it's really much better than altitude, and to change this to a material that's going to be rounded is really quite easy. We could change this object, just click on Create Metablob, and we'll let that refresh. And now we have a nice rounding overall, and we see a much better looking flame. Of course, the more detail we add, and the more objects to actually create the shape of our object, it's going to make some major differences. But all we need is that little bit of a round effect on the bottom just to get that blue to really come out and blend correctly. So let's create another object. I'm just going to delete our second meta blob that we just created. I'm going to move our camera around a little. And we're going to create sort of a wall of fire. And I'm going to add a cylinder. And keep in mind too that we want to be working at frame 0 because we don't want to be creating any animation. And currently right now there technically is no animation on our material. I just have a position keyframe made for our first meta blob, which is now just a big overall object. So we want to take our cylinder, and we're going to rotate this to the side, and we can also see that our material has automatically been added to it, but we're going to see some changes once we rotate this. So I'm going to bring this around to about 90 degrees, and if we go to our numeric section and under our orientation, we want to change our roll to 90, and that way it's perfect. But the only thing is, because we've rotated our object, our flames are now going in the wrong direction, which is another advantage to using metablobs. Because once we create a metablob object, it's going to reset our origin, and that way our material will be going in the correct direction. So I'm just going to stretch this out. We're not going to worry about that current material that's on there because that's not going to be displayed correctly. And what I want to do is copy this cylinder and paste it, and we're going to move it up. And now we're going to stretch it on the y-axis, and we can also move it up a little bit more. And this is going to create a very nice shape where we can see it will blend with a little more of a peak on top, like we have for our other object. So we can take cylinder 3 and 4 that's showing up in our layers, go over to the left, create a metablob object. We can see that showing up. It's also corrected the direction of our fire, which we can see. But just to make sure that everything loads up correctly, select our first object that we had. And actually, before we go and copy and paste that, I also want to bake this object. So I'm going to right mouse click, select Bake to Polygons, and we can bring that up to about around 50,000 polygons. You can go less. Really just kind of play around with it, see how many you really need in order to create your object. And now we'll just select our first object, right mouse click on our preview, select Copy Material. Now go to our new metablob, right mouse click, and paste material. Now because of the overall size change between these objects, we're noticing a lot of spacing in our flames. So when applying to different shapes, we do need to make a few changes in order to compensate for that overall change. I'm just going to remove our first metablob so that we're just working on our new shape, which is going to be our wall of fire. And if we take a look at the side, keep in mind it is a volume. So as we look through it, we can see all of our flames lining up. And from the side, it's all sort of blending together. But when we take a look at it from more at the front, we see a lot of spacing in between our overall flames. So we need to make just a little modification in order for that to match up. We can either adjust our scale, but pretty much we have the correct scale because it's basically the same size as our other object. We just need to adjust some of our other settings to fill it in a little bit more. So we'll double click on our material to open up the Advanced Material Editor. We're going to go to our Color and Density tab, and what we can do is decrease our fuzziness. And if we take a look as it updates, the more we decrease this fuzziness value, we can see our flame showing up a lot more. And if we look at the top, we can also see, because we've reduced our fuzziness, that we're getting a little bit sharper around the edges. So you might need to also make some other modifications to the actual size of our function. I'm going to click OK and just increase our scale to about 1.4. And now we can see that a little bit better. And because the way our object was a little more dense, the way we were looking at it, it'll definitely create a different sort of fire effect. So we might need to fill in this volume by actually adjusting the functions. So when you're transferring from one object to another, it's just one thing to keep in mind is that different shapes, and since we're working with an overall volume, they will fill in differently. If we start to take a look at this from an angle, it starts to look alright. It looks like it's completely filled in, and if you're going to be looking at it from an angle, then you really don't need to worry about it. But if you're going to be direct, looking at the front of this object, you're probably going to want to fill it in. And we can either do that by reducing our fuzziness more. We can click OK and take a look at that. And that definitely looks a lot better. Or we can adjust that actual function and just bring in the amounts that are being removed from our scene. So now we could preview this object and take a look at the flames. And since if we take a look at our Advanced Material Editor, and under Lighting and Effects, we can see that our velocity of material origin is still set from our previous material. So that way, we still make sure that it is animated. If we want our flames to go faster, we can just increase this value on the Z. So instead of -20, if we wanted it to go twice as fast, we can set it to -40. And then we can also apply this and basically just put it on top of other objects. So if we wanted, let's just make a burning cylinder. So we can create another cylinder. And I'm going to load in just a default surface for this right now. Under Rocks, select Default, click OK. Now we can adjust our rotation. Go to our numeric value and just set that to 90. And then we can stretch it out. Undo. It didn't stretch in the correct direction because I didn't have our handle perfectly selected. So we'll just make sure that X is selected correctly, and then we can just start moving that down into the flames. And you can see a little bit better how the volume works as well once we actually have an object in there. But it gives a very neat effect where it actually looks like this cylinder, or any object we put this on top of, is going to be on fire. And since we can see a lot of gaps in there, we can go back to our material for our fire, and we can increase the density all the way up to 10, and that starts to fill in a little bit more. We could also go beyond the value of 10. We could type in 20, and now we're seeing really bright flames, and it's more filtered and more covering our cylinder. But we definitely see much brighter values. So I'm going to bring that down to a 10, where we were before. And we could always scale this in. And just squish in our fire object a little. And now we're just showing less of that material, which is also a great way to animate. So let's just apply this to a couple of more objects. And I'm going to delete our cylinder so that we just have our flame object. And I'm going to add a toroid. So we add our torus, and we want to rotate this. So we have about a 90-degree rotation currently on our X. We could look at the specific values for that and set that to 270 on our pitch, and that way it matches up correctly. We can go ahead and scale this object. Now, because of our overall change in our position, our flames, which are already being added, aren't going to look correct, and they're going the wrong direction because of that orientation change we made. So we could convert that to a meta blob, or we could just convert this directly and bake it to polygons, since we have the overall round shape that we already need. So we can right mouse click on the torus, bake to polygon, set this to around 24,000, and let that bake. But we can still see the overall orientation of our object is still the same. So we could either use a meta blob, and that will change it, or we can alter the material itself, editing its rotation options. But once you're working with a material animated surface, that's going to be difficult to do. And I actually want to add a little bit of variation to this anyway, so we're going to use a meta blob. So I can undo the bake that we just did, and we're going to double click on our torus and make it a little bit thinner. Click OK, copy and paste it, and we want to move it upward, and I'm also going to scale it out, and then we can double click and make it a little bit thinner. Scale it outward if we need to a little bit more, and now we can select these two toruses, move over to the left, create a meta blob object, and now our fire is going in the correct direction. We can right mouse click and bake these to polygons. We're going to set that to around 25,000. We can go to our meta blob, our first object with our fire, right mouse click, copy, go to our new object and paste it, just to make sure everything's set up correctly. And then we can delete our first object, and we can focus entirely on this new object where we can see this nice ring of fire. And because of the overall shape, we might need to fill in specific areas. We can see along the edges where there's more volume that it's definitely filling in a lot more, sort of with the Fresnel effect, which affects mainly transparent objects, where if you take a look on the sides, since there is more mass, it will show up as more of a solid object. And we can also see, because of the overall shape of this object, that we're seeing much more of our blue flame, and that's directly related to the fact that we were using slope to control our blue flame. So we can stretch this upwards a little more, and that would reduce it, and then we can see more of our yellow flame. And then we could also fill that value in, and just fill in our shape a little bit more by reducing our fuzziness. And now we can see more dense flames, a lot more of them. But because a lot of it is overlapping, we might need to adjust our luminosity or our density and just make it to fit correctly. We could also scale that down and bring that down to a scale of 1. And now we're seeing much more flames, although it doesn't quite look correct with this current size. So there's little bits of changes you have to do in order to really bring them over to other types of objects without having to create entirely new objects and new materials. But overall, this will still give us a really neat looking effect. And if you take a look in the folders on the CD-ROM or the download, there's a variety of animations that are showing different things you can do with these fire materials, and how you can create some really interesting looking fire and animations.